One of the quotes that I read recently in When the Body Says No is about how shame is the deepest of the so-called negative emotions.
Yeah.
And shame is a big theme in my show and in my life.
Right.
Why would that be the deepest of the negative emotions?
It's very interesting about shame. We always think that shame has to do with doing something wrong and then we're ashamed of it. But in fact, shame begins long before there's any idea of doing anything wrong. Shame is not primarily an emotion. It doesn't begin as an emotion. At least what it is really is an activation of a certain part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which basically makes everything go slack. So in a shame state, your neck falls, your head falls, your eyes look away, and you're like this. This is the shame state. Now you can induce shame in a 9-month-old baby who's got no concept of having done anything wrong. And how you induce shame, the shame reaction in an infant, is if the mother and infant are looking into each other's eyes and the mother looks away, the infant goes into a shame state. So shame primarily has to do with loss of contact with those that you need to be in contact with. Later on, the concept of you're losing contact because you did something wrong gets grafted into it, because parents sometimes have to shame their kids. Now sometimes it's good that a kid should go slack. If a kid is about to jump off the kitchen table at age 2 or do something bad and you yell at them, don't do that, if they relax, then they won't hurt themselves. But when you've done that, you've broken the contact between you and the kid. That's how you do it. Now, if then the parent goes on, instead of rebuilding that contact, or Gerhard Kaufman, who writes about shame very eloquently, he says, if the parent doesn't rebuild that interpersonal bridge that's just been broken, then the child begins to feel that there's something wrong with them inherently. So sometimes we have to shame our kids in a sense of a quick breakage of the relationship just in order to stop some unacceptable or dangerous behavior. But then if we make the kid believe that it's something wrong with them, then the shame state becomes ingrained, and that shame state is a state of isolation, which is, of course, the worst thing a human being can experience, because contact is the biggest need that we have. So shame goes back really a long way into pre-verbal days, and it's toxic. When you run into difficulties, and you very well might, because you might feel really lousy. I mean, it's not a experience that one does for the joyride. First of all, as TJ, I think, indicates in his play, it just tastes bloody awful. And secondly, you can get nausea and who knows what, you know. Diarrhea sometimes, that happens not so much, but that's just another way of purging. It usually comes out one end or the other. Sometimes, but anyway, so what I'm saying is you may not feel very good, and sometimes you might feel terror. And I've seen people experience sheer terror. The advice is that first you just try and stay with that and be curious about it. What is this about? Like a meditation, you know, like in a meditation, you don't try and make anything happen, you just observe whatever's going on with some curiosity. And ask the plant, well, what are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to show me here with this terror that I'm experiencing? What do I need to know here? And a lot of people, if they do that, they'll get through it. Now, however, if they're actually stuck with it and they're just not able to get past it and they really feel they need help, we're encouraging people to just say, I need help. And if they need help, then one of the ayahuasqueros will come over to them and will help them. Or one of the helpers will come over to help them physically if that's what they need. Sometimes a person just might need help to get up and go to the bathroom because they're a little bit off balance. That can happen. Or they might need more specific help to get through a very difficult, dark emotional state. And then, if they need to, at that moment, to talk, if they really have to get it out of themselves, then I'll go off with them and we'll just talk a little bit. So we encourage people to, as I say, be with the experience, but if they find that difficult or intolerable, they're really encouraged to seek help at that moment and to verbalize the need for help. If you find yourself in a difficult spot and you're really thinking you just can't make it on your own, or you just ask for help. And a lot of people do. And as TJ reveals in his play, he didn't. He had a very dark experience, but typically for him, he didn't ask for help. And usually, when people don't, it reflects how they live their lives. When stuff happens and we don't process it as kids because we don't get the support to process it, we get cut off from certain parts of ourselves. Then to become whole again, we have to reconnect. And that's what healing means to me. Now in this culture, for all kinds of reasons that I won't go into now, but for all kinds of reasons, very few children get the kind of support where they can really stay connected to themselves completely. So most people who grow up in this culture will have some healing to do. And as parents, yeah, we're going to, one way or another, create problems for our kids. That's not a tragedy, that's just how it is. And as a therapist once said to me, if your parents give you this much shit and you give your kids only this much, you've done a great job. So now, does everybody need to? There's no need here. Nobody's talking about need. We're talking about, do you as a person, and not as a parent now, but just as a person, find the areas in your life where you're not fully in touch with yourself, where you're not fully realized, where you're not fully expressed, where there's certain repeated patterns in your behavior that continue to cause you some degree of grief, and yet you don't know how to give them up? If the answer is yes to any of those questions, then I'd say there's room for healing should you wish to take that on. There's no need to take it on. You can lead a perfectly okay life without taking anything on. But that's just an individual decision. So we're not saying, I'm not saying certainly that you need to do anything. It's a question, is there something here that tells you that you could be getting more out of life, that you could be more alive in your life? And if the answer is yes, well then yeah, then the job of becoming whole is something that may engage you. And yeah, almost inevitably, again, in this culture, we tend to create some difficulties for our kids, and not because we don't love them, not because we don't do our best, but just because of the stressed nature of the society that we live in, and the fact that we have stuff that we haven't fully resolved yet. There have been people who've had cancer who've come to my retreats, but I can't say that because they participated, the ayahuasca helped them experience remission. I believe that's highly likely and highly possible and even likely because of what I believe about cancer, which is that the cancer is really but basically when we suppress ourselves, when we suppress our emotions, we also suppress our immune systems because of the demonstrated unity between mind and body. You can't separate the two. So people that suppress anger also will suppress their immune systems. And so therefore when people can open, and so that the cancer comes along, and this is strange to say this, but I'm sure many of you have heard this yourselves, but I certainly have as a physician, that somebody with cancer, and sometimes even with terminal cancer, or some other terrible disease. Today I was leading a workshop for some addiction workers, and a woman comes up to me and tells me that she had something called Guillain-Barré disease, which is a paralyzing post-viral condition, very dangerous and could leave you paralyzed. And she said it was the best thing that ever happened to her. And people have said the same to me about cancer. So when you say, what are they talking about? How many of you heard such statements? How many of you have heard people say that kind of thing? Well, many of you have. And what they're talking about, of course, is that the experience of dealing with that disease connected them to themselves.
Made them whole.
Sorry?
Made them whole.
It made them whole, yeah. Not that the cancer did, but dealing with it did. Yeah, it made them whole. And so they're very grateful for that. So I think, and I've known people, not through ayahuasca, but people who've done other kind of spiritual work and so on, who've had amazing remissions, way beyond medical prognoses. Because if the cancer comes along to say no on your behalf when you didn't, if you learn how to say no, then the cancer says, okay, I don't need to hang around anymore. Now that's a simplistic way of putting it, but I think it can work that way. And I've seen many examples where it has. So I think that certainly ayahuasca or other psychedelic modalities can be powerfully used that way. The problem is, of course, it's impossible to study this in any systematic sense because it's not legal and it's impossible to set up a clinical study with any of these substances. But I very much believe that could be used that way.
But there was a guy on the retreat that I was on who had ALS.
Yeah.
And after the second ceremony, he made the statement that he'd come to realize that saving his life wasn't about extending it.
Yeah, that's right. He said, I want my life. And after the second ceremony, he said, I realize now that when I said I want my life, I thought that we should extend my life, but I mean now that I want to live while I'm alive. And he did, and he died 3 months ago. He came to us at a very late stage of ALS. But I think that potentially a lot of people could heal. I don't know that, but that's my impression. No, there are certain medications that are contraindicated. The SSRIs are contraindicated. Interestingly enough, by the way, I looked at that question recently because somebody very close to me wanted to do ayahuasca ceremonies, and he'd been taking an SSRI medication. And so I looked into that question very much, and theoretically there's a risk. I think in practice the risk is much less. And I won't go into the technicalities, but certainly for safety's sake, if somebody's going to come to my ceremonies, they're going to have to be off their SSRIs for a certain period of time. Look, I think that's the more broken things are, the more people want some kind of solution. We're living in a highly stressed society, and we're living in a highly medicated society. And people are necessarily seeing the limitations of mainstream medical practice. Not that it doesn't offer a lot of great stuff, but it's also in a very narrow range of perspective that it offers it. And just as a lot of people are seeking some meaning in spiritual work these days, a lot of people are also looking at medicinal modalities beyond the mainstream, just because of the recognition that things aren't working. So I think the interest in this stuff is a reflection of the failure, really, and sometimes a desperate failure of the mainstream medical system, and particularly the pharmacological approaches. And then, don't forget the spiritual aspect here. I mean, people have always looked for some ways of connecting, and of course, native traditions all around the world have always used plants. Here in North America, the peyote, the tobacco, alcoholic spirits in some areas, the mushrooms, in the Amazon, the ayahuasca and other plants, the San Pedro, in Africa, the ibogaine, or the iboga plant. So that, there's just more openness now for the reason that we live in a more global village, if you like. We're more aware of these things, and also we have more of a need for them. I never worry about those things too much. I just do what I do because I think it works, or it's useful, or I'm interested in it. And systemically, I don't see any big changes coming up, certainly not under this government. They had actually approved ayahuasca for religious purposes, in Canada. Health Canada went through a investigative process. They decided it wasn't addictive, it wasn't harmful, and that for religious purposes it should be approved. That was the recommendation of the expert staff. The minister just nixed that. And so I'm not looking for much change that way. There's an organization called MAPS. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's a group called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for the Study of Psychedelic Science. And MAPS is sponsoring a study that's going to be conducted here in British Columbia, in Vancouver, as it's being done elsewhere as well with MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder. This has been approved by Health Canada because MAPS has the resources and the organization get it through the... But that's much easier to do because MDMA is a dose-controllable specific entity. Ayahuasca is a drink that you can't measure, and you couldn't fit it into the clinical study box. So what I'm saying is that organizationally and professionally, there's a lot of people working on it. So I think what's going to happen, and if you look at the literature, there's more and more articles now on the value of psilocybin, mushroom, and end-of-life issues, in dealing with depression. So there's more and more professional literature. There's more and more literature on iboga, and its amazing capacity to help people detox from opiates in a day or two. Can you believe that? Somebody could be on heroin for 10 years. They do ibogaine once or twice. They don't have withdrawal symptoms. What we do is we put them on methadone for years, where we could actually get them off their opiates. So there's more and more literature, but I don't see much movement politically. So the question is, do we wait for the politicians to wake up, which ain't going to happen, not in my lifetime, or do we just carry on the work that we're able to do under such conditions that we can create for ourselves? And if you're in the health field, I would say the same thing might be true for you. Well, it seems to activate, this is a very simplistic explanation, and to tell you the truth, I keep reading the neurophysiology of it and I keep forgetting it. I don't really care. But it seems to activate two brain centers for sure. One of them are childhood memories are stored, deep emotional childhood memories are stored. And so whatever people are experiencing, whatever terror they're experiencing is actually, to me, explainable that it's a memory they're having. Not necessarily a memory of a specific event, but a memory of an emotional state that they experienced in childhood. So it triggers those circuits. But like with my daughter, it also enlivens circuits where insight is activated. So they're able to look at their childhood experiences with some adult insight. So they can, again, accompany themselves into some of the most difficult experiences of childhood. And by the way, some people have very joyful, blissful experiences, and it's not like it's uniformly dark for people, and it could be one night and another night. And you might have a blissful experience one night, and you think, oh my, great, I can hardly wait, and the next night you get really slammed, or vice versa, I don't know. But the point is that to be able to revisit those childhood places where you felt hurt and alone and scared, but to be able to accompany yourself to those places in a safe environment really is what the healing is about. So I think that's why it works. Now, the shamans or the ayahuasqueros we work with would add, well, the spirit of the plant is guiding you. You're getting guidance here for somebody higher than your little egoic self. So for them, there'd be that spiritual dimension as well. And some people have spiritual experiences.